Hello, everyone, and welcome to your daily dose of your spiritual vitamin with me, Bobby B. Now, this morning, we're going to pick up on the introduction that talks about David and Goliath. But to start this study off, we're going to learn a little something about Goliath first, and then we'll get into the challenge. So, as we begin our story, let's learn something about Goliath, the most infamous giant of all times. Every culture influenced by the Judeo-Christian ethic has heard of David and Goliath. This story has been told to countless children to illustrate that good can triumph over evil in spite of insurmountable odds. What is often obscured in this infamous story is the giant Philistine's race. He was a man of color. The Philistines, father of the Philistines, and he was Ham's great-grandson through Mizam's Egyptian lineage. This is found in Genesis 10:14. Hence, the Philistines were people of color, descendants from Ham, father of the black races. The Philistine named Goliath, whose name means splendor, was a black giant from this tribe of Ham. Here is David's showdown with Goliath. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel on the mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, or Gath, whose height was about 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and the target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. One bearing shield went before him. And this was in 1 Samuel 7, verses 1 through 7. Astute Bible students cite the symbolism of the number 6 in relation to Goliath. He had 6 pieces of armor. He was 6 cubic feet tall, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. If he was like his brothers, he had 6 fingers. 2 Samuel 21 and 20. The number 666 is in the number used by another man who will be arrayed in splendor, the Antichrist. The story continues. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall be your our servants and serve us." When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of Ephraite and Bethlehem, Judah. Ephraite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons. And 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to battle. And David was the youngest. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And Jesse said unto David his son, "Take now for thy brother an ephah of the parched oxen, of the parched corn, and these 10 loaves of bread, and run the camp to thy brethren." So he was told to take this food to his brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheese undo the captain of the thousands, and look how the brethren fare. And David rose up early in the morning, and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he had to trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle. And David came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up with the champion the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, and they saw the men, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man that is to come up? Surely to defy Israel, and he come up, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free of Israel." And David spake to the man, and he stood by them, saying, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" That's in 1 Samuel 17. David referred to the black man's genitalia with scorn, because at that time only Abraham's descendants practiced the custom of circumcision, which showed their covenant with the true and living God. And Elijah, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Elijah's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left the sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride, and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down till thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I done? Is there no cause? And when the words were heard which David spake, and rehearsed before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with the Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art able to go against the Philistine to fight with him? For thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and I smote him, and slew him. The servant slew both the lion and the bear. And the uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them. Saying he had defiled the armies of the living God, David said, Moreover, the Lord that hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. And he took off his staff in his hand, and he chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in his shepherd's bag, which he had kept in a script. And his sling was in one hand, and he drew near the Philistine. 1 Samuel, verse 7. A description of how Black the giant viewed the Jew shepherd boy is as follows. And when the Philistine looked out and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of fair countenance. So he was a reddish color. According to Webster's New Colloquial Dictionary, the word ruddy means reddish in color, and having a healthy reddish color. The introduction of the reddish color in David can be traced to his Canaanite great-great-grandmother named Rahab, whose family survived Jericho's wall tumbling down. The Canaanites were cousins of Mizraim's, Egypt, and English. Let's see here. Whose name meant soil red. Thence, the reddish color of the shepherd boy can be explained by the interracial marriage of Rahab, the Canaanite harlot, and his Shemitic great-great-grandfather Solomon. And David, and feared in David's gender genealogical record in Matthew 1:5-6. It shows that young David had 1/16 Canaanite blood, which he had been given him the reddish color for the Jewish lad. Okay, so his reddish color came from the Canaanite line. Had David lived in the early American era of slavery, he would have been considered black because of his 1/16 Canaanite blood. It is also interesting to ponder that later David took the descendants of Ham's wife, impregnated her, and he knew he could pass the child off as being that of the one of the Canaanite warriors who was a man of color. His royal warrior known as Uriah the Hittite Canaanite. 2 Samuel 11:11. David versus Goliath. This innocent-faced Jewish shepherd boy approached nearly 10-foot tall black warrior. The giant took in his insult and began cursing David by the Philistines' gods. Judges 10:6. The Philistines were known as soothsayers or channelers. Isaiah 2:6. So most of your Philistines were known as soothsayers. And the Philistines came on and drew near unto David. And when the Philistines looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy, of fair or beautiful countenance. And the Philistines said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves, with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Then David said to the Philistines, Thou comest to me with the sword, and with the spear, and with the shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of the host of God, of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. This day will the Lord deliver those into mine hand, and all the earth may know that there is the God of Israel. And all the assembly shall know the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, but the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you out of his hand. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose, he came and drew nigh unto David, that David hastened and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out one stone and slung it and smote the Philistine in the forehead. And the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And he smote the Philistine giant. He slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took the sword and drew it out, the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And the Philistines saw their champion was dead, and they fled. 1 Samuel 17:16. It's interesting what happened to the skull of this decapitated black giant. After the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it into Jerusalem. And David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines. Abner took him, brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. David appeared before the king with the great giant's black head in his hand. The skull of Israel's greatest enemy was impaled for all to see. So they put his head on a stick, mounted it out front. After the celebrating died down, the head of the giant had to be taken outside the city limits and buried on the hill, because it was unlawful to bury the dead within Jerusalem. 2,000 years later, Jesus was forced to bear his crown in a place called the place of a skull, which would be the place where Goliath laid, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. John 19:17. It is supposed that the name of this place means the place of a skull. It was formerly called Golgotha, but over the years it translated into Golgotha, a place of the skull. When looking at the hill of Golgotha, some say it's a death blow to the black giant, foreshadowing how Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd, will puncture the power of darkness in the place of the skull, while having his own heel bruised on the cross in Genesis 3, verse 15. It's fascinating that the Hebrew word Golgotha, meaning the place of the skull, is likely the place of the skull of the black giant named Goliath in Matthew 27 and 33. Okay? And that's blacks in the Bible. All this time I never knew that Goliath was black. I knew he was a giant. I never knew that David had Canaanite blood in him on 16th, which was actually from a cursed tribe, Rahab. But it's interesting. Little known black facts about who you are and where you come from, being one of color. It's interesting, the history in the Bible, that they don't give you the detail. And these are stories that are told regularly to children from the Bible. So, on that note, I say be blessed, my beloved. And remember, no matter how small you are, you can do all things through Christ. And you all be blessed today. Go slay the Goliaths in your life, my Davids, because you are among the righteous and the elect. You belong to God the Father, and that's the same God that empowers David. So, you too, much like David, go slew those dragons. Be blessed, my beloved. It's time for the next daily dose. Your spiritual vitamin with me, Bonnie B. Be blessed.